The watch cracked with a tired click, and the back plate shifted just enough to reveal it. A thread of micro-engraving, shallow as a whisper. 3 fragments. Coordinates, a locker number, and a date that still tightens a throat. There was one more thing. A single name cut so small it lived between scratches. 30 years of silence pressed into metal. He'd inherited the watch from an estate attorney who barely looked up. A broken heirloom from a father who'd vanished. The engraving pointed past grief toward a hidden journal waiting off-site. If that journal was right, abandonment wasn't betrayal. It was protection. To understand why, we need to go back to the last day he was seen. He left mid-morning, keys in his palm, saying he'd be back before lunch. It was a routine errand. Bank, hardware store, home. No coat, no overnight bag. The kind of ordinary exit you forget to notice until it becomes the last moment you ever get. By late afternoon, the phone rang. It wasn't him. It was a friend asking if everything was okay. It wasn't. His car turned up intact in a municipal lot 4 blocks from the bank, locked. No signs of struggle. The account he used for day-to-day expenses was frozen without explanation. And there was no note. Nothing to hold but the echo. The thing about absence is that it multiplies. Bills kept arriving. The mortgage didn't care about unanswered questions. Their world compressed around late fees and grocery lists, and a mother who learned how to make less stretch farther. Meanwhile, whispers gathered like dust in a small town, and every well-intended glance felt like a verdict. Abandonment became the story because it was the only story people could see. Authorities treated it as a voluntary disappearance. On paper, a clean adult with the right to walk out. There were interviews, timelines, a polite investigation that dimmed with each passing week. The file lived in a drawer with a label that meant no leads. Officially, it stalled. Unofficially, the family kept searching long after the case went quiet. The son grew up inside that silence. He learned to read faces the way other kids read books, scanning for any hint of truth. He became guarded, practical, good at fixing what he could touch because he couldn't fix the one thing that mattered. A childhood organizes itself around what's missing. It becomes the map you carry into adulthood. There was one artifact that didn't fit, his father's pocket watch. He wore it every day, a habit as reliable as sunrise. When he vanished, the watch vanished too. No one saw it again. The mother kept a duplicate chain in the kitchen drawer like a talisman that made no promises. In the first year, there was a voicemail, 8 seconds of static and a breath. The timestamp matched an evening when the son sat on the front steps waiting for headlights that never turned the corner. He replayed that breath for years, treating it like evidence, like proof of life, like a thread that might lead somewhere. It never did. What nobody knew at the time was that the story was already moving under the surface. Bank account freezes usually leave fingerprints, paperwork, signatures, a process. This one didn't, at least not where anyone could see. The car's location was too neat, too close to places where cameras didn't point in the right direction. It looked like an exit, mapped to be forgettable. Family lore hardened into accusation. He left. He chose something else. He chose someone else. Stories like that calcify because they explain pain without having to sit in it. And yet there were inconsistencies. A half-finished project in the garage, appointments on next week's calendar, dry cleaning tickets unclaimed. People planning to disappear don't leave wet coffee in the sink. Meanwhile, something else was happening that only made sense years later. The mother received 2 letters with no return address, each with a single line, "You're fine. Stay quiet." She threw them away in anger. She says now that she wishes she'd kept them, not for proof, but for context. This was the moment everything changed, though no one recognized it then. A small discrepancy at the bank. A teller remembered him hesitating, glancing toward the door as if timing mattered, then stepping aside to let someone move ahead. It was nothing, and it was everything. a choice to be seen less. In the aftermath, legal language took over. There are forms for disappearing, declarations, notices, the practical machinery of erasing a person from paperwork so life can be lived by the people they left behind. It took years to complete. Each signature was a small surrender, and yet the watch stayed missing, absorbed into the myth. The son grew into a man who wore no jewelry, who didn't trust keepsakes, who flinched when clocks stopped. Time had been unreliable. He made his own. Unknown to them, across town, a safe deposit box renewal was paid on schedule for 2 consecutive years after the disappearance, then closed without withdrawal. No name anyone recognized, no access logs that survived a system upgrade. A thread cut just as the family gave up on threads. The thing about human nature is that we reach for a story that hurts less. So they built one that allowed life to keep going. He left, we stayed. End of sentence. But there was one problem. The story didn't account for the missing watch. It would take 3 decades, and a state attorney with a stack of neutral envelopes and a cracked backplate to find out why the watch was missing with him. Because while the town moved on, something else was hidden in plain sight, pressed into brass, and waiting for the right hands. Meanwhile, something else was happening inside that watch. The estate handoff felt transactional. Papers slid across a desk, a pen that didn't work on the first try, a condolence spoken like a punctuation mark. Then the envelope. Inside, the pocket watch, heavier than memory allowed. Its crystal was spidered, its second hand frozen between moments. He turned it over. Along the rim, hairline damage. Along the hinge, a faint lift, as if the case had breathed and never exhaled. Opening it posed a choice that lived in his chest for days. If he forced it, he might shatter the last object his father chose to keep. If he didn't, the questions would keep him awake like they always had. He set it on the table and watched afternoon light slip over it. Time, still dictating its terms. A local jeweler took one look and shook his head. Too delicate. Wrong era. He could polish, but not pry. The son left with the same weight he'd carried in. He wasn't looking for shine. He was looking for a door. So we brought in a horologist. Careful hands, calm voice, a magnifier that made the watch's imperfections look like terrain. On a padded mat, the watch became a map to be read. See this? The expert said softly, touching a near-invisible notch at the case edge. A pressure pin. It didn't belong on this model. Someone had added a mechanism where none should be. The stakes rose in that quiet. If the watch held a message, opening it was more than curiosity. It was risking a line his father had drawn with intention. The son's hand hovered, then withdrew. He took out his phone, photographed every angle, the hinge, the notch, the scratches that might not be scratches. Documentation before discovery. A promise to do this carefully. The pin yielded beneath a precise tool. The back didn't swing, it slid. A false layer disengaging with a tired sigh. Beneath it, not gears, but a wafer-thin panel etched by a patient blade. The engraving ran small as thread, 3 fragments arranged like coordinates on a compass. Numbers separated by dots and dashes. A locker number. And a date. The date mattered. It fell in the week before the disappearance, close enough to taste. This wasn't a coincidence. This was planted. It meant the watch wasn't an heirloom. It was a device designed to outlast the danger that forced its creation. The son traced the numbers with his eyes, not daring to touch. There was one more feature that didn't make sense. Along the inner wall, a seam that looked cosmetic but felt like resistance when pressed. The horologist paused, then applied the same tool with a lighter hand. A second compartment side open, hardly more than a crease in the brass. Inside, a sliver of paper, brittle and pale. For when it's safe, it read, cramped and unadorned. Safety had been a moving target for 30 years. The message turned the absence into a protocol. The son let the words sit in his palm and felt the room narrow to breath and heartbeat. He wasn't just inheriting an object. He was inheriting a timeline. He wrote the numbers down twice. He checked the date against the calendar he kept of everything that had ever seemed important about that week. Receipts, headlines, weather. It aligned. He turned to the single name cut so small it hid between scratches. A name he'd never heard spoken in his house. If the watch was a map, that name was a legend. He wrote it down too, separate from the rest. Here's the part we can verify. The coordinates didn't point to a grave. They didn't point to a wooded overlook or a ferry terminal. They landed on a street of short, windowless buildings with keypad doors and roll-up bays. A storage facility that had been in business under different owners for 4 decades. A place for people who keep things they aren't ready to hold. He stood at the counter with the locker number in his pocket and the sliver of paper tucked in his wallet like a vow. He didn't say the name from the watch. He didn't need to. The clerk typed, looked puzzled, then called a manager. There were gaps in the records, system upgrades, paper logs boxed and stacked, but the number existed. Fees had been paid, on time, in cash, by someone who never offered a phone number. The last payment had been made 2 years before the estate notice arrived. While that was happening in that fluorescent office, the watch sat in his jacket like a pulse. The thing about hidden compartments is that they imply more of them. If a watch can carry a map, what else can carry a message? He signed forms acknowledging liability he couldn't measure, accepted a key that wasn't new, and walked a corridor that smelled like dust and oil. At the unit door, he held the key and failed to insert it twice. He let himself fail, then tried again. The lock turned. The door rolled up, and the world he thought he knew took a step to the left. Opening a public locker after decades isn't just a turn of a key. It's the risk of inheriting trouble you didn't ask for. What if the names inside still mattered? What if the story you find belongs to people who can't defend themselves? He knew this as the door rattled up, and the breath of stale air met him like a held exhale. Inside, no furniture, no dramatic reveal. An oilskin bundle set neatly on a plastic tote, 3 envelopes stacked like steps, and a small metal box the size of a paperback, its corners taped, its top scarred. He didn't touch anything for a long beat. The thing about secrets is that they change once they're handled. He wanted the moment before to last because once he knew, he couldn't unknow. The oilskin loosened with a soft crackle. A journal slid free, filled notebook size, edges darkened, its spine mended with cloth tape. On the first page, a date from the year before the disappearance and a single sentence. Write what's necessary. The voice that followed was spare, almost tactical. Entries in short lines, times and places, initials instead of names. When a name did appear, a razor had shaved it into a gray smear. He wrote about debt, about a business loan that turned out not to be a loan so much as a leash, about people who expected repayment with interest measured in loyalty. He laid out pressure points, a small charity he'd launched on the belief that good could snowball. Then, deposits that arrived too clean, too regular, from donors with cash-heavy profiles. He wrote the word laundering once and circled it, then underlined unknowing. Complicity by ignorance becomes guilt by association. The entries tracked meetings in back booths, a promise to cooperate, and the day he learned the promise leaked before he even left the building. Meanwhile, the envelopes waited. The first was dated 1 week before he vanished. Inside, bank statements that showed balances swept into a trust with a beneficiary listed in careful legal terms that meant my family without me. A notarized letter transferring assets if he didn't return within a fixed window. It was paperwork written like a farewell disguised as a contingency plan. The second envelope carried the first year's worth of small proofs that he'd remained in orbit. Blurry photos shot from sidewalks and ball fields. The son at a crosswalk. The mother loading groceries. Dates pinned on the backs in the same tight hand as the journal. Receipts for money orders sent to a landlord account that mysteriously reflected adjustments when bills ran hot. He called it watchfulness, never love. He kept the language dry, as if emotion might compromise the purpose. The small metal box felt heavier than it should. Inside were contact logs, initials paired with dates and payphone locations, notes about a handler who hated risk, and a meeting where he signed an agreement to serve as an informant for an investigation already underway. He recorded threats with unsettling precision, times they'd referenced, routes they knew, the line about accidents that read like a promise. One entry turned the watch into a mechanism. Wound tight meant it was safe to approach. Unwound meant stay away. The watch wasn't just a keepsake, it was a signal. What nobody knew at the time was who he'd crossed. The journal kept that carefully buried. He wrote the group and the man and their guy at the bank. He listed case numbers without agencies attached. But the pattern came through. He'd stepped into a current stronger than he realized, tried to turn, and found he couldn't without dragging his family into it with him. The third envelope was heavier, labeled with a date years later and a single word. If. He set it aside. There was a choice to make before breaking that seal. If the journal was true, revealing names could endanger people who'd built new lives. If it was false, the story collapsed, and his father stayed a deserter. The stakes weren't abstract. They breathed in that narrow corridor where fluorescent lights flickered. He read a passage 3 times. They know her route. They said the workplace, Tuesday the backlot. I told them I'd be gone before then. I told them to watch the watch. That line bent the last day into profile. It reframed an absence as a firewall. A man stepping into the lightning so it wouldn't ground through his family. He closed the journal and looked at the storage unit as if it might answer what he should do next. The decision wasn't whether to believe his father. It was how to handle the truth without causing new harm. He photographed pages that contained only logistics and dates. He redacted what had already been redacted. He wrapped the journal back in oilskin like returning a parable to its envelope. Then he opened the third envelope. Inside, a short letter and a list of case docket numbers that matched the years after he disappeared. The letter didn't ask for forgiveness. It asked for caution. Keep this with people who keep records. Don't say the names out loud. If it's safe, tell them why I couldn't call. He stood in that locker and felt the old story loosen its grip. The watch had become a map, and the map had led not to a grave, but to a choice about what to do with the truth he'd finally found. If the journal was right, naming names could still ripple into lives that had finally gone quiet. If it was wrong, the entire narrative collapsed into wishful thinking. So he tested what could be tested, without exposing anyone who hadn't chosen exposure. First, the dates. The docket numbers from the third envelope align with public filings in those same years. Bankruptcy petitions, sealed motions in a fraud probe, a cluster of forfeiture cases that landed 2 years after the disappearance. The language was dry, but the timing matched the journal's rhythm. When the entries described interviews, the court calendars showed in-camera hearings. When the entries went silent for a month, a major indictment dropped. Correlation isn't proof, but it isn't nothing. Then the charity. On paper, it bloomed and vanished inside 18 months. Small checks at first, then abrupt donations that rounded just a little too neatly. The donors had addresses that connected to cash businesses, and those businesses folded or changed hands as investigations heated. The charity shut down right when the journal said it became clear the money was carrying more than good intentions. He wrote, "They picked me because I looked clean." They were right. Complicity by ignorance becomes guilt by association. That line wasn't moral theater. It was a map of how ordinary people get pulled into currents they don't see until they're already moving. What nobody knew at the time was how quickly cooperate can become complicate. He agreed to work with investigators. The journal marks the meeting like a time-stamped incision. He left by a side door, took a long route home, and still, somebody knew. Threats arrived, not as vague menace, but as precision. Tuesday, back lot, after closing. He recorded it the way a medic records symptoms, exact, unemotional, useful under pressure. The same page that taught us the watch's code made the stakes plain. Wound tight meant the house was safe to approach. Unwound meant stay away. Absence translated into a system. He tried to keep working. He notes a time he showed at a back booth and decided the angle of a stranger's hat was wrong. He walked past, turned at the corner, and didn't go back. He writes about a handler who hated improvisation and a field office that moves slow because slow preserves cases. Slow also puts targets into the space where their lives still happen. School drop-offs, grocery runs, familiar routes that become predictable. He saw the pattern forming around the people he loved. He decided to break it by removing the most predictable piece, himself. We look for traces of the people he described without repeating his mistake of leaving a trail. Cross-referencing public records, we found business names that mirrored the initials in the margins. We saw a bank officer resign inside the window the journal flagged with 2 underlines and the word "their guy." He never wrote the name. He wrote the function. The filing showed a man in that function leaving under personal reasons right before disciplinary findings surfaced off camera. The scaffolding of the story kept holding. Then the human notes cut through the logistics. On one page, a grocery list, coffee, socks, batteries, sits above a paragraph about the son's 6th birthday. He wanted a model kit. I picked it up and put it back. If I hand it to him, I put a handprint where they can see it. The gift he never gave became a symbol he couldn't risk. The thing about a father's instinct is that it doesn't care about legal strategy. It cares about pressure points. He would be the one you could find, so he made himself harder to find. He tried what decent people try. He thought cooperation would be a bridge. But there was one problem. Bridges run both directions. When word of his role leaked, calls came from numbers he didn't know, and the calls moved from warning to schedule. "If you want out, tell her goodbye," one message said. He archived the line without embellishment. The next entry is short. "I won't teach them the map." And then the plan takes shape in fragments. Car placement, account freezes, a route that leads to anonymous corridors, and a watch that carries a code the family can read without words. Impact isn't always loud. In the filings that followed, assets shifted out of reach for the right people and into structures that paid tuition, kept the roof steady, balanced utilities when the ledger ran hot. His disappearance, reframed by the paperwork, looks less like abandonment and more like a firewall. He became the lightning rod, so the strike wouldn't land where it could do the most damage. Meanwhile, something else was happening that we can point to without crossing lines. 2 years after his vanishing, the docket numbers from the 3rd envelope align with arrests that never made national news, but mattered to the people who lived under their reach. The journal lists a city by initials. The filings show defendants from that city entering pleas. It isn't a hero story. It's a ledger. He contributed testimony. Others did too. Cases moved. Some pled out. One figure, the kind you remove twice because the first time doesn't stick, came back into play after a technicality. The journal's tone shifts there. Delay return. Watch the watch. The human cost lives in the spaces between those entries. He worked jobs that left no footprint. He noted a limp that worsened after a fall he couldn't afford to treat. He taped medical notes into the back and drew a line through a clinic's name, the way you cross out what you can't risk repeating. He wasn't hiding to avoid consequences. He was hiding because consequence had a face and a schedule. So when the question comes, why didn't he call? The journal answers in his voice without sentiment. Because the foundation was cracking, and you clear the house before you repair it. He couldn't clear it with a phone call. He could clear it by removing the thing the pressure was pushing toward. He could make himself the only door they could try. But there was one problem. Running doesn't end a storm. It only changes where it lands. Exile doesn't announce itself. It seeps in. The journal's tone thins after the first rush of decisions and settles into a record of motion without arrival. Cities appear as initials, S, then L, then 2 months in R. The entries shrink to fragments. A room over a garage, a cash job sweeping after close, a bus transfer missed on purpose to shake a tale that may not have been there. Identity becomes logistics. Purpose becomes caution. He tracked his limp like weather. Early on, it's stiff in the cold. Later, it's stare slow. Then a clip note. Fell on ice. No clinic. A pharmacy receipt. Ibuprofen, elastic wrap is taped beside a page where he writes that pain is useful because it keeps you from forgetting what you owe. He keeps the language flat, almost punishing. The thing about survival is that it can look like penance when you've made the choice to carry danger away from the people you love. He lists jobs the way other people list relatives. Dish pit, night stock, patch crew, watchman. No paper, paid cash. Leave when questions start. He doesn't complain. He observes. A foreman who demands silence. A landlord who notices nothing, which is a kindness. A diner where a server refills coffee without looking him in the eye, which is also a kindness. Exile simplifies the ledger of needs. You need work. You need quiet. You need no one to remember your name. Meanwhile, back home, the calendar moves without him. The journal marks the son's milestones indirectly. June, graduation week, he writes. And the next page holds a receipt from a toy store bearing that month and year. He buys something small, returns it, buys a gift card, never sends it. The receipt lives in the spine like a splinter. Another page carries a postcard of a city skyline. Thought about mailing, he writes. No return address to choose that won't say too much. He tucks the card behind another entry and leaves it there. The micro-stories stack. Almost gestures, nearly contacts, a life lived just outside the frame. The metal box from the locker fills in the parallel action that the journal only alludes to. Contact logs with a handler, meetings in libraries, phone calls from booths that still took coins. He notes when arrests land 2 years after he disappeared. 2 down, he writes, not triumphantly, but as an accounting. Then the turning point. Prosecutions move, and in a short, tentative line, he allows a plan. If safe by spring, return. He drafts a letter titled, When It's Safe, and the pages for a moment widen. He names a coffee shop near the old neighborhood, a day of the week, a time. He imagines walking in. He imagines waiting. Then the relapse hits the case like a dropped wrench, a figure released on appeal. The journal doesn't detail the law. It details the consequence. Back on the street, triangles again. He draws a small symbol beside the note, a triangle he'd used earlier to mark people who moved money and information. Delay return, he writes. Watch the watch. Protective reflex overrides longing. The plan retracts like a hand from heat. He keeps moving. Cities by initials become towns by mile markers. He describes the loneliness without calling it by name. He writes about a laundromat that plays old game shows and how the contestants' forced smiles make him ache. He writes about a church basement where coffee is free and a folded bulletin paper works as a coaster. He writes, rarely, about regret. Not the kind that wishes for a different choice, but the kind that counts the cost paid by others. Her fear, he notes about the son's mother. His distance, he notes about the boy. He doesn't ask to be absolved. He writes the ledger honestly and lets it stand. Clipped into the journal with a rusted paperclip, there's a set of medical notes in another hand. Blood pressure. A sprain not healed right. A doctor's advice to rest, which he underlines as if it were a luxury item. He writes, work anyway, in the margin. The limp becomes a character he carries. It slows him. It keeps him from running toward what he wants. It keeps him alive by reminding him not to run at all. He inventories small kindnesses. A mechanic who undercharges for a part. A motel owner who switches a room without asking why. He records a conversation with a stranger about baseball that lasts exactly the length of a bus ride. And he writes, didn't correct him when he named the wrong team because it felt good to disagree about something that wouldn't hurt anyone. Isolation narrows trust, but it doesn't erase the need for human noise. The metal box holds proof of his contribution. Copies of sworn statements with sections blacked out, date stamps that line up with news the family never connected to him. He doesn't claim victories. He notes outcomes. Sentenced, deferred, dismissed. He watches from the edges of cities that don't know he's there. When a cluster of entries shows movement, a series of initials crossed out with a single line, he drafts again. Return? He paused that question like a worry stone and then writes, wait. The final page is slow. The handwriting loosens. He starts to say thank you in the oddest places. Thank you to the woman who put extra ice in his cup. Thank you to a mail carrier who nodded. Thank you to the bus driver who waited when he limped. Regret and gratitude sit side by side like two chairs in an empty room. If forgiveness is possible, he writes, it will be a practice, not a single moment. He doesn't say who needs to practice it. He knows the answer is everyone. To understand why he never called, you have to read the letter he never mailed. That's where his voice finally rests. Envelope 3 was addressed in a hand that looked familiar, only because of the restraint. No flourishes, just a name, the son's name, and a date that landed in the year his first child was born. The seal lifted cleanly, as if it had been waiting for this specific moment, not a day sooner. Inside, a single sheet and something wrapped in tissue. He unfolded the letter first. The voice that had been clipped and tactical in the journal loosened here, but not by much. He kept the sentences plain, as if extra words might sound like excuses. I won't waste your time, it began. I made choices that took me away from you. I won't pretend they didn't hurt you. I won't ask you to pretend they were easy for me. He wrote about the informant agreement in terms that matched the contact logs. Times, rooms, a plastic pen that skipped when he signed. He wrote about the threats delivered to the mother's workplace, the parking lot at closing, the specific Tuesday he tried to outrun in advance. He didn't lean on fear. He recorded it like weather. Danger moved close, he wrote, closer than I could ask you to stand. Then came the analogy he'd underlined in the journal and saved for this page. Think of a house, he wrote. A foundation cracked. You want to fix it, but the load above it will crush you if you don't clear the rooms first. I couldn't repair what I'd broken with you standing upstairs. Clearing you out meant clearing myself out too. He didn't name it strategy or love. He called it sequence. The invisible order that kept people from being hurt while the structure got repaired. He admitted what he'd missed. Birthdays, games, the way a boy's voice changes and then deepens. The ordinary afternoons that make a life feel like it belongs to you. I stood in the outfield once, he wrote, at a park that smelled like cut grass and mustard. I watched you strike out and shake it off like it didn't matter. I wanted to say it didn't matter. I left before the final inning because staying would have mattered too much to the wrong people. The sentence landed without sentiment, and yet it carried more feeling than anything he'd allowed himself to write before. Keyline, unadorned. Absence isn't love, but it was the only shield I had. He didn't try to elevate it. He put it on the page like a truth he'd had to hold without comfort. He described a moment outside the mother's workplace, sitting in a car he'd bought under a name that didn't belong to him. He saw her laugh with a coworker, saw her glance at the sky like she was measuring weather, saw the relief in her posture when she walked to her car without looking over her shoulder. I wanted to give that back to you and to her, he wrote. I had to be the thing that took it away from me. Then he turned to the grandson he'd never meet. Don't make me a story you need to defend, he wrote. If you tell him about me, tell him gently. Not a hero, not a villain. A man who reached for a tool and learned too late it was a lever attached to something bigger. Tell him that courage sometimes looks like staying and sometimes looks like leaving. Tell him that either way, it costs. He refused absolution. Don't stand up for me in rooms where people are still healing, he wrote. Let silence do that work. If I helped put stones in the jar, others carried the jar. They deserve the quiet more than I do. He included a list of people he'd helped testify, initials only, a lattice of cases we'd already cross-referenced without saying names. He wrote, "If any are still breathing and want peace, don't take it from them by making me a conversation." It wasn't humility. It was a boundary. He owned the watch. He explained the code. Wound tight meant safe. Unwound meant don't come home. And the reason he'd turned a keepsake into a map. "I knew you'd look for what didn't fit," he wrote. "You are good at fixing what you can touch." He acknowledged the smallness of paper against the size of years. "This letter does not pay the debt," he wrote. "It only itemizes it. If forgiveness is possible, let it be a practice, not a transaction. Practice it toward yourself first, toward me if there's room." He put the ask at the end, where it couldn't push the rest off the table. He folded the final paragraph around a wish he allowed himself for the first time. "If you keep anything of mine, keep the part that watched." I never stopped, not because watching is enough, but because not watching would have turned me into the kind of man I feared becoming. I stayed near in the only way left to me. It was thin. It was real. He set the letter down and opened the tissue. Inside lay the original watch chain, polished by years of use, and a small locket that clicked open to reveal a tiny photo. Mother and son. In a booth, faces turned toward someone just off frame. Tucked beneath was a narrow strip of paper listing case dockets. We already knew. A breadcrumb trail confirming caution. The letter closed with a line that felt like a hand held out. Not to be shaken, but to be seen. "If this ever reaches you, it means the house is steadier. Do what you need to do. If you choose to forgive, let it change you more than it changes me." Truth needs a container, not a headline. A place where it can live without hurting anyone it doesn't have to. So we brought the journal, the letters, and the docket list to legal counsel who specializes in records that outlive their authors. The guidance was measured. Preserve originals, copy only what's already public, and strip anything that points to people who never chose this story. An archivist took gloved hands to the pages and photographed them in raking light, capturing indentations where razors had lifted names. The images went into a sealed collection with restricted access. The filings we could cite were linked to case numbers, not people. We created distance on purpose. The thing about stewardship is that it asks you to protect both the truth and the living. Then came the conversations that mattered more than documents. He sat with his mother at a kitchen table that had witnessed every version of this family's weather. He laid out the watch, the code, the letter. She didn't cry. She pressed 2 fingers to the engraving and closed her eyes. "I knew the fear," she said. "I didn't know the plan." She admitted the letters she'd thrown away. She admitted the nights she kept a light on for no reason other than to feel less hunted by shadows she couldn't name. He called victim advocates who keep maps of harm without printing them. They confirmed arrests that matched the timeline. They declined to say names, the way professionals do when the dignity of survivors matters more than satisfying curiosity. Corroboration landed like a quiet nod, not a vindication, a frame. He held the watch, wound it once, felt the resistance, and set it down. Deciding not to wear it became its own kind of ritual. Keepsakes can be anchors or weights. He chose to let it live as a symbol of caution, of care, of a man who tried to speak in signals when words endangered the room. Anger didn't vanish. It changed shape. It softened at the edges where grief had made a home. He let himself mourn the birthdays, stolen by a ledger of decisions he didn't make. He let gratitude sit next to that mourning without asking either to move. That balance is a practice, not a posture. He asked himself the question the letter wouldn't answer for him. What now? The decision emerged in steps. Preserve the journal in a repository that keeps delicate records safer than houses do. Share the letter with the grandson when he's ready, not when history demands it. Build a redacted account that explains the watch, the locker, the choice, without converting any private person into public material. He spoke the one sentence that mattered to the child he'd once been. He left, And he also stayed. Both can be true. The watch became a bridge, not a blade. It didn't absolve the ache, but it gave it context that didn't cut as deep. Unknown to them, across town, a clerk boxed the last of the paper logs that would ever bear the locker number and marked them for long-term storage. Paper ending where it started. Meanwhile, the archivist's accession number gave the journal a new address. It wouldn't be a relic in a drawer anymore. It would be a record with a protocol. He called the estate attorney and closed the loop no one else could see. He called a friend he hadn't told and said only, "I learned something." He walked past the field where a new set of kids took turns missing easy pitches and thought about how practice is mostly missing until it isn't. Which brings us to where this journey lands. Not in certainty, but in a different kind of love. One that holds the wound and the reason side by side and chooses, again and again, not to turn them into weapons. Forgiveness doesn't rewrite years. It teaches your hands how to hold them without breaking. Secrets warp families, but truth, handled gently, can be a bridge instead of a blade. If this story resonated, look again at the artifact you've avoided, the watch, the letter, the photograph, and ask what else it could mean. Subscribe to uncover more quiet acts of courage and the hidden chapters that shaped them.